I stepped into my home just hours after my husband's funeral, and everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, too loud, like a storm waiting to break. Cardboard boxes were stacked in the hallway, and strangers moved through the living room with methodical efficiency. My mother-in-law was folding my clothes, her hands precise and deliberate, as if I had already vanished from this world. A man I didn't recognize rifled through my bedroom drawers, while the low hum of conversation buzzed around me. My chest tightened, a mix of grief and disbelief, and I barely whispered, "What is going on?" No one answered. They continued as though I were a shadow, an invisible presence in what had once been my sanctuary. Then my father-in-law, Harold Brooks, turned slowly to face me, his cold gaze locked onto mine. And with a calmness that made my blood run cold, he said, "You were never family." Behind him, a woman in a navy suit checked off items on a clipboard as if orchestrating a business transaction rather than invading someone else's home. That's when the realization hit me. They weren't helping me, they were erasing me. The home I had shared with my husband for over a decade was being stripped of my presence, my belongings, my life. And no one had asked for my permission. I stood frozen, absorbing it all. My grief still raw, but now mingled with a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. They believed they could take everything without consequence. I didn't speak immediately. Instead, I observed, my mother-in-law folded my favorite sweater with such meticulous care that it almost seemed cruel. Harold's expression never wavered, but I noticed the slight twitch in his jaw, a hint that maybe he hadn't expected me to be standing there, watching. The woman in the suit gave a quick glance toward Harold, as if silently confirming the next step in a plan I wasn't meant to know about. I finally broke the silence, my voice measured. "You missed something." The room froze. Even Harold blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The strangers paused in mid-motion. Miniaturized panic fluttered beneath the surface of their controlled movements. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. For the first time since entering the house, I sensed that I had some measure of power in this situation. I let them continue packing, pretending to be still overwhelmed by grief. But inwardly, I was assessing every detail. Who was taking what? Which items were prioritized? Which boxes held documents or valuables? And which were mere distractions? Every action, every glance, every hesitation became data I could use later. When Harold finally spoke again, his voice sharper this time, he tried to assert dominance. "Everything here belongs to the family now." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral, my heart pounding. They thought I was defeated. They thought I didn't notice the little inconsistencies, the hurried labeling, the small signs of fear in one of the strangers. They didn't know I had been observing everything, every movement, every glance, every word. They didn't know that what they saw as my weakness was the calm before the storm. I placed my purse on the table with deliberate care, letting my gaze sweep the room. My mother-in-law's hands paused on a sweater. Harold's brow furrowed just slightly. Even the woman in the suit, who had seemed so untouchable, hesitated. I let the silence stretch, long enough for them to feel it, for the weight of my attention to settle on them like an invisible hand. Then I took a step closer to Harold, my voice low but unwavering. "You forgot one thing." His confident smirk faltered. Just for a heartbeat. The room seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. It was subtle, but it was enough. I had made the first move, and the first crack in their certainty appeared. I didn't explain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. They were about to learn that standing still and watching can be far more dangerous than reacting. I turned toward my bedroom, leaving the folder in plain sight, a promise of the power and truth yet to be revealed. The first move had been made, and the game had only just begun. I stood in my bedroom doorway, clutching the folder I had managed to retrieve before the family even noticed. My hands were steady, but my heart raced. Every rustle of paper, every creak from the hallway reminded me that they still thought they were in control. I didn't rush. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I let them work, letting their overconfidence grow, giving me time to assess, to plan, to strike when the moment was right. The woman in the navy suit glanced up, noticing my hands on the folder. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see the faintest hint of unease, though she quickly masked it. For months I had grieved, but now I felt a quiet determination building within me. This was no longer about loss. This was about survival and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. I walked slowly back into the living room, placing the folder on the table with deliberate care. The movement drew every eye, and I could see Harold Brooks tense almost imperceptibly. "This won't change anything," he said, attempting to assert control. I remained silent, letting the folder speak for itself. The room went quiet, the low hum of the packing stopping as all attention shifted to me. I could sense the subtle crack in their certainty. I opened the folder, sliding out papers neatly. They expected a will, a typical declaration of inheritance. "This isn't a will," I said, my voice calm, almost detached. Harold scoffed. "We've already reviewed the will," as if that invalidated anything else. The woman in the suit leaned forward, a hint of curiosity breaking her professional composure. I smiled faintly, revealing the first layer of the surprise. Inside were contracts and agreements, documents I had never shared with the family. They detailed the company my husband and I had built quietly, the business we had nurtured from a side project into something valuable. The timing was meticulous, signed and notarized just weeks before his death. These papers established me not just as a widow, but as a legal partner in the company, with rights that no one else had anticipated. I flipped through the pages until I reached the survivorship clause. If one partner died, the other gained full operational control. Harold's jaw tightened ever so slightly, almost imperceptible. But I could see the momentary falter in his confident facade. The woman in the suit asked, "When was this signed?" And I replied evenly, 3 weeks before he died. The air thickened. That timing alone suggested foresight, planning, and perhaps even a warning. Harold tried to dismiss it, his voice sharp. "This isn't relevant," I countered, calm but firm. "It's more relevant than you realize." My eyes swept across the room. I observed reactions, tiny shifts in posture, a hand tightening on a box, a glance exchanged between the sister-in-law and mother-in-law. They were beginning to understand, but they had yet to grasp the full extent. The woman in the suit requested to examine the folder. She skimmed quickly, her careful movements betraying her focus. The way she paused at a page, tapping it lightly, suggested she saw something significant. I noted every hesitation, every flicker of doubt, as the foundation of their plan began to erode. My husband had thought ahead, and now, with Daniel's assistance, so would I. A name caught my eye, listed as the temporary controlling party of certain operations. Harold Brooks. I felt a flicker of doubt cross my mind, but it was quickly replaced by clarity. He had anticipated control, perhaps even collusion, but he hadn't counted on all the layers I now understood. The subtle tensions in the room confirmed my observation. Cracks were appearing in their orchestrated confidence. I closed the folder slowly and let it rest on the table. I walked toward Harold deliberately, my voice steady. "So this is your control?" "Yes. But it's only temporary." The slight twitch in his expression betrayed surprise. Even the woman in the suit looked uncertain. I didn't need to elaborate. They could feel the shift in power. I picked up my phone to call my lawyer, knowing the next steps would be decisive. Harold's eyes flickered toward the device, registering the threat even before I spoke. Daniel's voice came through clearly, confirming what I had suspected. This was bigger than inheritance, bigger than grief. It was a game of strategy, and the pieces were now moving on my terms. As I hung up, I looked back at Harold and the room filled with my husband's family. They still believed they were in control, but for the first time, they were beginning to doubt. I turned back to the folder, a small smile playing on my lips. They thought they had seen everything. They thought they had planned for every eventuality. But they hadn't counted on me. I left the room for a moment, letting the tension linger behind me as I tried to process everything the folder had revealed. The files inside weren't just contracts, they were a blueprint of my husband's hidden world. A world I had only glimpsed in quiet moments over the years. My mind raced as I pieced together the puzzle. The company we had built together, quietly and carefully, was far more significant than I had realized. The family had no idea about its true value or the rights I held within it. A memory flashed unbidden. Late nights in our kitchen, Ethan leaning over his laptop, muttering quietly as he typed, "If anything ever happens to me, don't trust my family with anything important," he had said. I had laughed it off, comforted by the routine of his meticulous nature, never realizing the weight behind those words. Now, the memory pressed down on me with startling clarity. He had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. Returning to the present, I realized the urgency of acting strategically. The family continued packing. Oblivious to the layers of power I now understood existed beneath the surface. I noticed the minor details, the boxes labeled in a specific order, the items prioritized for removal, the careful handling of documents. Each movement, each glance, was part of a plan I was only now beginning to decipher. Their confidence was a mistake, one I intended to exploit. I sat down at my desk and opened my phone, navigating to the shared email account Ethan and I had kept for company matters. A draft email caught my eye, unopened and dated just days before his death. The subject line read, "Urgent, restructuring." My hands trembled slightly as I read the contents. Ethan had been warning me, leaving instructions that were never meant to be discovered by anyone but me and the lawyer. Every detail in that draft was a carefully placed safeguard. Returning to the living room with this new understanding, I observed the family again. Harold's posture had shifted. He was more assertive now, trying to maintain control in front of the others. His sister and mother moved quickly, stacking boxes as though their diligence would solidify their claim. But subtle cracks betrayed them. Hesitation in movements, furtive glances, a flicker of uncertainty in their expressions. I saw it all, and my resolve strengthened. I examined the contract once more, this time noticing a secondary clause that had escaped my initial attention. It referenced a temporary transfer of operational authority under extraordinary circumstances. I realized that someone had positioned the company to shift control in very specific ways that could be challenged if handled correctly. The timing, the foresight, and the complexity all pointed to one conclusion. Ethan had prepared for potential conflict with his family, and the tools to reclaim control were in my hands. A deeper suspicion began to form. Why had Harold assumed immediate control so confidently? Why did they arrive at my home with such precision, expecting the documents and boxes to be at their fingertips? The coordination suggested foreknowledge or inside information. My internal alarm sharpened. This wasn't just opportunistic behavior born from grief. This was premeditated. The family was waiting for a chance to claim what they assumed was theirs. But they had underestimated my awareness and my husband's foresight. I focused on Harold once more. His confidence was unwavering on the surface. Yet the slightest twitch of his fingers betrayed unease. The woman in the navy suit, who had orchestrated their packing with meticulous professionalism, now avoided my gaze, her composure faltering slightly. Even without saying a word, the shift in power was palpable. I knew, in that moment, that the family's certainty was beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. Reaching for my phone again, I prepared to contact my lawyer. The realization settled firmly in my mind. This was no longer just about retrieving documents or asserting ownership. It was about understanding the full scope of Ethan's preparation, reading the hidden signals, and leveraging every detail to regain control. They believed they were untouchable. They didn't know I had the insight, the evidence, and the resolve to challenge them effectively. As I pressed my thumb to call, I glanced back at the room. Harold continued pacing, unaware of the storm building quietly behind my calm demeanor. The boxes, the documents, the misplaced confidence, they were all pieces of a game I was now fully aware of. and I was ready to play. The moment stretched, heavy with anticipation. Every glance, every movement in the room, now felt measured against the knowledge I had uncovered. They thought they had the upper hand, but for the first time, I could see the cracks forming in their facade. I inhaled deeply, steadying my resolve. The next steps I would take would determine everything. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt a quiet surge of control. I stared at my phone, reading the message from my lawyer again. The company structure isn't what you think. Call me now. My hands tightened around the device, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. Voices from the hallway continued, oblivious to the storm brewing quietly in my mind. Every step, every rustle of paper reminded me that the family still thought they controlled everything. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I absorbed the moment, letting the weight of the message sink in. I dialed my lawyer, Mark Ellison, my voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline. Mark, I need clarity. What are we looking at? His voice was calm but serious. Naomi, the company ownership has been altered recently. There's a temporary control transfer filed legally, and it was set in motion before your husband passed. You never authorized it. My stomach tightened. The timing alone was unsettling. Before his death, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Mark confirmed. Someone was preparing for this. You need to understand that this wasn't just opportunistic, it was premeditated. I ended the call and returned to the living room. The family was still working. Boxes stacked carefully. Documents sorted. Harold's expression remained confident. But I noticed subtle shifts, slight hesitations, furtive glances. His demeanor no longer carried the same unshakable authority. I kept my voice neutral. Everything settled? I asked. Stepping closer. His response was sharp, but I could sense the calculation behind it. Yes, for now. I studied him carefully, noting the tension beneath his composed exterior. He believed he had planned for every eventuality, but he had not anticipated that I was aware of the full scope of the hidden details. The woman in the navy suit moved beside him, professional as always, but her eyes flicked toward me with a hint of doubt. I opened the folder on the table again, studying the clauses that I had skimmed before. A secondary clause caught my attention, one referencing a conditional override in case of dispute, specifically tied to extraordinary circumstances. The implication was clear. Control could be challenged if I acted correctly. My mind worked quickly, connecting the dots between the timing of the agreements, the immediate actions of the family, and the pre-arranged fail-safes my husband had put in place. Harold attempted to regain the upper hand, dismissing my findings with a sharp tone. This isn't relevant. I looked directly at him. Calm but firm. Not relevant. Or inconvenient. My words were measured, each syllable carrying weight. I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a subtle crack in the facade he had maintained since my return. The woman in the suit stepped closer, asking to examine the folder. Her movements were careful, almost hesitant, a contrast to the confidence she had displayed earlier. As she skimmed through the pages, I noticed her pause at certain lines, her expression revealing a quiet realization that the situation was far more complex than she had anticipated. A name listed as the temporary controlling party caught my attention, Harold Brooks. The familiar feeling of unease settled in my chest. He had assumed control with the assurance of certainty, but even his confident movements now betrayed slight anxiety. Every subtle shift in their behavior reinforced the truth I had begun to understand. The family had anticipated control, but they had underestimated me. I leaned slightly forward, my voice steady, calm. So this is your control, correct? But only temporary. Harold's confident smirk faltered, a micro-expression I caught immediately. The woman in the suit shifted, her demeanor changing, acknowledging the subtle power shift without speaking. I didn't need to elaborate. The room understood that the balance had begun to tilt. Reaching for my phone, I prepared to call my lawyer again, knowing that the next steps would define the trajectory of this conflict. Harold's eyes flicked to the device, registering the potential threat even before I spoke. Daniel's guidance from earlier in the day reinforced my resolve. The game had expanded beyond inheritance disputes. It was strategic, and the moves were now mine to orchestrate. As I pressed the call button, I glanced back at the family. They still assumed dominance, still believed the house and the company were theirs to manipulate. But for the first time, I felt the thrill of awareness, of insight. Every decision, every hesitation on their part, was now information I could use. They had underestimated me, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt the quiet surge of control that comes from knowing you see the board when everyone else is still guessing. I knew I couldn't face Harold and the rest of the family alone. I needed someone who understood the inner workings of the company better than I ever could. There was only one person I could think of, Daniel Reeves, the former CTO. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, not since he left the company under tense circumstances. But now he was the only ally who could help me navigate this web of deception. I arranged to meet him at a quiet coffee shop downtown, a neutral place where no one from the family could interfere. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting lines across the table where we sat, creating a quiet, tense atmosphere. Daniel arrived cautiously, his eyes immediately locking on mine. There was a weight in the air, a mix of concern and anticipation. "I heard it's worse than I thought," he said softly. I nodded, my mind racing. "It's not just the house, Daniel. It's the company. They've already started moving against me." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I kept a copy of everything when I left, the company's financial records. Contracts, internal communications. Not a single file was missing." He slid a folder across the table toward me. I opened it carefully, flipping through pages of detailed information. This wasn't just about money, it was evidence of the family's unauthorized access. Their attempts to take control before I even arrived home. Daniel's voice grew more serious as he continued. "Your husband anticipated something like this. He left a fail-safe system. If someone tried to take over or manipulate the company after his death, it could be activated. But it's conditional. You can't just claim it without proof that the family acted improperly." I absorbed the weight of his words. My husband had been thinking ahead, preparing for the exact scenario that had unfolded. All this time, I had believed the contracts and documents were sufficient. But now I understood. To reclaim true control, I had to prove intentional wrongdoing. It wasn't just about asserting my rights, it was about strategy, precision, and timing. Daniel opened another section of the folder, showing me a document labeled Emergency Control Measures. "This is what your husband left for you. It allows you to regain control of operations, finances, and decision-making authority, but only if you can demonstrate fraudulent or unauthorized activity by the family." My heart pounded as I read the details. Every clause, every line, was meticulously planned. The knowledge that Ethan had anticipated every possible move gave me a sense of strength I hadn't felt since his funeral. We spent hours outlining a strategy. I needed to gather all relevant documents from the house, track transactions the family initiated, and document every inconsistency. Daniel emphasized caution. One wrong move and they could lock you out completely. You have to be patient, deliberate, and precise. His warning was a reminder that this was no longer a personal confrontation. It was a calculated battle with high stakes. Then Daniel revealed our first breakthrough. One of the files showed unauthorized access to company accounts by a family member. Timestamps overlapping with the funeral events. Miniaturized panic began to settle in me, not fear, but the realization that leverage was finally within my reach. They thought they were untouchable, that their plan had gone unnoticed. But this evidence, carefully documented and preserved, gave me the upper hand. Returning to the townhouse later that day, I observed the family with renewed focus. Every movement, every glance, every slight hesitation became data. They were overconfident, and their arrogance only highlighted their vulnerabilities. Harold paced as if nothing had changed, unaware that each step was being tracked. The woman in the navy suit, so precise and professional in the past, now hesitated subtly, betraying her growing unease. I could feel the quiet power shifting in the room. I didn't confront anyone yet, didn't raise my voice, and didn't need to. The family had already started making mistakes, revealing cracks in their confidence without realizing it. I had Daniel. I had evidence. And I had foresight. The next steps would determine everything. But for the first time in days, I felt the sense of control that comes from knowing you are no longer at the mercy of others. As Daniel left, he handed me a USB with critical files and whispered, "This is just the beginning." I watched him go, and I turned to look at Harold and the others. They still believed they had the upper hand, but they had no idea how much the tide had already shifted. The game had changed, and now, quietly, I held the pieces. I decided to play along, pretending to be weakened, letting the family believe I was out of options. Every step I took was calculated. I let them see the grief, the fatigue, the apparent helplessness, while inside, my mind was already several moves ahead. Harold's confidence grew with each box they stacked, each document they handled. They had no idea that every action they took was being noted, every word being recorded. The family moved aggressively, signing papers and transferring assets as though victory was already theirs. Harold glanced at his watch repeatedly, urging them along, assuming that speed would secure their control. I let the tension build, pretending to watch silently from a corner, my expression neutral, my hands relaxed. Yet every flicker of hesitation, every subtle glance, was stored in my mind for later leverage. I began collecting evidence discreetly, photographs of documents, audio recordings of their conversations, timestamps of the files they moved. Every detail mattered. The family continued to act as if they were untouchable, but I knew that each signature, each hurried transfer, was creating the very evidence I needed to reverse everything. The overconfidence that had once intimidated me now became their vulnerability. Daniel activated the fail-safe system we had discussed, tracking every transaction and documenting every move. A quiet alert appeared on my phone. Every action they had taken in the house, every paper moved, was recorded and stored securely. They had no idea that the game had shifted entirely. The subtle tension in the room grew almost imperceptibly, and I smiled quietly to myself. Their sense of control was an illusion, as I observed. Small cracks began to show. Harold noticed irregularities in some of the documents and paused briefly, his confidence flickering. My mother-in-law froze mid-step, staring at a paper she had just placed in a box. Even the sister-in-law's hands shook slightly as she moved a stack of folders. The woman in the suit, once composed and professional, stepped back, whispering to Harold. Their overconfidence had begun to crumble. Harold made his first mistake, trying to accelerate the process further, signing additional transfers without fully reviewing them. Daniel noted these irregularities, indicating that fraud or unauthorized action was becoming evident. The family was acting under the false belief that they had complete control, and every rash move they made only strengthened my legal position. Suddenly, my lawyer appeared at the townhouse unannounced. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. He confronted Harold directly, presenting evidence of potential fraud and unauthorized transfers. The confident facade Harold had maintained for days faltered. The mother-in-law froze completely, and a box slipped from her hands. My eyes met Harold's, and for the first time, I saw real uncertainty in him. Through it all, I remained calm, quietly observing the reactions. Every glance, every twitch, every pause became confirmation that the tide had turned. Daniel and my lawyer coordinated behind the scenes, confirming that all the evidence we had collected would prevent the family from asserting control without facing serious legal consequences. My quiet composure contrasted sharply with their unraveling confidence. As the day drew to a close, I realized the significance of what had just occurred. The family, so sure of their authority, had walked straight into the trap that my husband had anticipated and that Daniel and I had meticulously set in motion. They had overreached, and their mistakes had been documented perfectly. I no longer feared their aggression or manipulation. Standing in the living room, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Harold glanced at me, attempting to reclaim his composure. But it was too late. The subtle shift in power was undeniable. They had believed they were untouchable, that their plan would succeed without resistance. Yet the entire scenario had unfolded according to the strategy Ethan had designed and Daniel had executed. Every move I had made, every pause, every observation had turned their overconfidence against them. The family did not yet fully grasp the depth of the consequences they faced. I knew this was only the beginning of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. And quietly, deliberately, I prepared for the next phase, aware that every action I took from this point forward would continue to tip the scales in my favor. Their supposed victory had already begun to collapse, and I stood ready to claim what was always meant to be mine. The family's overconfidence was almost palpable as they continued packing, moving quickly as though nothing could stop them. Harold paced back and forth, a stack of papers in his hand, projecting authority. His mother fussed over the arrangement of boxes, and his sister scurried around, trying to keep everything in order. They laughed lightly between tasks, trading jokes that were meant to convey control, but the tension in the air suggested cracks they couldn't see. I watched silently, letting their arrogance work against them, noting every detail, every hesitation, every glance that betrayed their underlying unease. My lawyer and Daniel arrived unexpectedly, and the subtle shift in the room was immediate. The confident hum of the family halted mid-action as they turned toward us. Daniel carried a folder, evidence meticulously documented, while my lawyer spoke calmly but with authority. "We have records of unauthorized access and transactions," he announced. Harold froze, mid-step, and my mother-in-law's hands hovered over a box, as if uncertain whether to set it down or retreat. Even the woman in the suit, who had seemed so untouchable, paused and looked on with a mix of concern and surprise. One by one, we presented the evidence. The signatures on key documents overlapped with funeral events. Accounts had been accessed without authorization. Transfers had been filed before my husband's passing. And each piece of documentation revealed the family's attempt to seize control prematurely. Every move they thought had been secret now stood exposed in black and white. Miniature panic rippled through them. Subtle but unmistakable. Harold's confident facade wavered as he glanced at the data we displayed. Then, a betrayal within their ranks emerged. One of the younger family members, overwhelmed by guilt or fear, admitted to altering documents. I didn't think she'd find out this fast." The voice confessed, trembling. The admission sent a ripple through the room. Even Harold's composure faltered. Their internal trust, carefully maintained, began to collapse under the weight of the evidence. I could feel the power shifting in the air, subtle but undeniable. My lawyer began invoking legal clauses, one after another. Survivorship rights, conditional overrides, proof of unauthorized transfers. Harold realized the potential consequences of his actions, and his voice dropped, unsteady. The family had assumed immunity, that their planning was sufficient. Now they faced the reality that their attempts could be interpreted as fraud. I remained calm, my composure contrasting sharply with the panic around me. Each moment reinforced the quiet satisfaction of seeing strategy triumph over arrogance. The first real victory came as my control over company operations was restored. Assets frozen during the dispute remained secure under my authority. Harold tried to speak, but the lawyer's firm interruption silenced him immediately. Sister-in-law's shoulders slumped. Mother-in-law looked pale, and Harold's eyes darted around, searching for any advantage he had assumed existed. Every subtle gesture now confirmed that the upper hand had shifted entirely. As the evidence continued to unfold, I discovered a final secret Ethan had left behind, a separate trust in my name, unknown to the family. This fund ensured that I had permanent control over key assets. No matter what challenges arose, the realization struck me with profound relief and empowerment. He had planned for every contingency, and now it was mine to claim. Many hooks of revelation and insight kept the energy tense yet controlled. I confronted Harold directly, my voice steady and calm. "You underestimated me from the beginning," I said. His confident expression faltered for the first time. The room was silent, each member of the family absorbing the truth. Their carefully orchestrated plan had failed, and the quiet, measured power they had dismissed was now undeniable. Daniel and my lawyer coordinated behind the scenes, confirming that all evidence was secured, leaving no possibility for them to reverse the outcome. Even as the dust settled, Daniel leaned in and whispered, "There's still one final thing your husband set up. You haven't seen it yet." My curiosity piqued, but I maintained my composure. The family's plans had completely unraveled, their confidence shattered, and my control fully restored. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a profound sense of closure and empowerment. I had not only reclaimed what was mine, but I had also uncovered the depth of my husband's foresight, proving that even in the most calculated attempts at control, the quietest person can ultimately dictate the outcome. Daniel handed me the folder with a quiet seriousness, the label on top reading Final Trust. My hands felt steady as I opened it, but inside, I found something that made my heart skip a beat. There, clearly laid out, were documents and financial accounts entirely in my name, company shares, a personal fund, and legal authority that no one in the family could touch. Even Harold, standing across the room, didn't realize the significance of what I held. My husband had planned for everything. He had ensured that no matter how far his family tried to stretch their hands into our life, I would always have the means to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I breathed deeply, letting the weight of realization settle over me. This wasn't just a legal safeguard, it was a message. Ethan had trusted me, prepared me, and positioned me to survive the storm the moment it began. The folder was more than papers, it was empowerment, strategy, and love woven together. I glanced at Harold, at his mother, and at the sister-in-law, and for the first time, I truly understood that they had never had real control. Every step, every assumption of dominance, had been based on a misconception, and now it crumbled before their eyes. I spread the documents on the table and began reviewing them with Daniel and my lawyer. Each page confirmed that the assets, both personal and business, were now fully secure under my authority. The company's operational control reverted to me, and the disputed transfers were frozen pending legal review. My husband's foresight had left a flawless path for reclaiming everything, and now I was walking it with confidence. Harold tried to interject, his voice sharp, but my lawyer cut him off. Presenting the evidence with precision, his authority evaporated in the silence that followed. I took a moment to walk through the townhouse, surveying the space that had felt hostile for days. The air seemed lighter now, filled with quiet possibility. Sunlight streamed through the windows, touching the furniture and the boxes that had once represented the family's assumed dominance. Every object that had been mishandled or prioritized for removal was now restored, a symbolic reclaiming of both space and autonomy. I paused by a photograph of Ethan and me, once tucked carelessly into a box, now back in its rightful place. A wave of closure passed over me, mixed with grief and a deep appreciation for the meticulous planning he had left behind. Harold and his family were forced to acknowledge the reality. The mother-in-law remained silent, her composure failing, while the sister-in-law's eyes dropped in quiet guilt. Harold's brow furrowed, a faint tremor in his jaw betraying the frustration he tried to hide. I had no need for confrontation. The truth spoke for itself. Respect isn't given by blood. I realized it is earned, maintained, and, when necessary, reclaimed through intelligence, patience, and courage. I sat down in the living room, letting the weight of the day's events settle. My husband's foresight had protected me from chaos, but it was my decisions now that determined the outcome. I could feel the quiet strength coursing through me, the sense that I was no longer a passive participant but the one orchestrating the next steps. Even the smallest gestures, The careful observation of their behavior, and the patience to act at the precise moment had shifted the balance irreversibly. Turning to Daniel, I asked about the final details he had hinted at earlier. He smiled faintly, handing me a small folder I hadn't noticed before. "This ensures you have complete authority over certain assets and funds in the future," he explained. The words settled over me like a shield. My husband had not only left me the tools to reclaim what was mine immediately, but he had also provided safeguards for the long term. I felt a profound sense of empowerment and closure, knowing that no one could take away my position, my agency, or my dignity. I reflected on the past days, the grief, the confrontation, the tension, and the silent battles fought in observation and patience. Each step had led to this moment, where control was restored, respect enforced, and the family's overconfidence dismantled without a single overt clash. I realized that true strength often manifests quietly, in preparation, observation, and the ability to act with precision when the time is right. As I looked around the room, I felt a sudden urge to share this experience, not just for closure, but to connect with others who may have felt powerless in their own lives. I addressed the camera in my mind, imagining the audience. Have you ever felt erased from your own life? Like no one respected your place? I know that feeling. But preparation, awareness, and calm determination can change everything. I smiled at the thought. Share your story in the comments. I want to hear how you reclaimed your power. I allowed a gentle invitation to linger in the room, guiding the viewers naturally toward engagement. If you've stayed this far, I continued. Make sure to subscribe. There are more stories of people who turned the tables, reclaimed what was theirs, and discovered that quiet strength often has the loudest impact. Finally, I stood and walked toward the window, sunlight illuminating the living room. My eyes scanned the space. Now secure, now mine. Internally, I affirmed, no one could take my place. No one could erase me. Not because of blood, but because I had never allowed them the power to do so. The air felt lighter, the tension replaced with clarity and control. I knew that the game was won, the future secure, and my own strength proven. The room was still, the family subdued, the documents safely in my hands. And with that, I felt a quiet victory settle over me, a victory not just for what I owned, but for the recognition, respect, and autonomy I had fought to reclaim. The story, for now, had reached its conclusion, but the lessons remained, clear and unshakable,